My name is Danny Akkad. I'm from the Akkad family, which is a well-known family in Damascus, Syria, but my story starts here. Firstly, my family's older generations do not have a big play in their immigration to Canada. However, newer generations such as my parents do. Syria is one of the oldest countries in the world, and my family originates from a city called Hama. Syria was under Ottoman rule from the 16th century to the beginning of the 20th century. Syria and Lebanon were one single country, which was colonized by France in 1920, also known as the French Mandate. Emir Faisal, the proclaimed king of Syria, only ruled for 2 months due to a clash in Syria by French forces, which was later named the Battle of Maysalun. Emir and his Syrians were defeated by French troops, which have led until 1946. Because pressure from Syrian nationalists evacuated the French forces out, so a large number of Syrians could speak French. This is why one may find today a lot of Syrians living in Quebec. Others chose to settle in other parts of Canada. However, my father came to Ontario to join his sister later on in 1976. He was born September 26, 1951, and at the age of 18 he was obligated to enroll himself into the Syrian army for a minimum of 2 years. His family had been very poor, and this is where the immigration patterns begin. Firstly, he went to look for a job in Germany and worked in a chocolate manufactory for 2 years, but he wasn't satisfied because it wasn't a job enough for him to raise a family. So he decided to go back once more to finish his military services in Syria, but it also didn't lead him to any job opportunities, so he traveled back into Germany and heard over there about new opportunities for immigrants that wanted to settle in Canada. So that's how he arrived in 1976. One of the leading factors for the immigration of Syrians had been to find better jobs and get out of Syria, because at the time they were controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and most of the workers didn't like their jobs or thought by immigrating anywhere it could lead to better opportunities in life. Since Canada has always been open to settlement of new immigrants, most Syrians, along with other nations, chose Canada as a place to settle. When my dad arrived, he spent about 2 months at his sister Sena's house in Toronto and worked at a donut shop nearby to make enough for him to buy an apartment. He began to have interest in raising a family and living in Canada permanently. Also in that same year, Canada decided to make a new immigration policy called the Immigration Act, which focused on who should be allowed in Canada rather than who should be kept out. The Immigration Act had 4 classes, which represented who could come into Canada, which included refugees, families, independent immigrants, and assisted relatives. My dad was a part of the independent immigrants, and the story started from there. My dad was also most likely allowed through the point system made in 1967, which was a more fair-based selection to the immigrants that wanted to come into Canada. If you got around a 67 out of 100 points on the point system, it was a pass. At the time, he was in the 20s, so that accumulated for 12 of the points. He has a sister living in Canada, which counts for 5 points for adaptability, etc. It was enough for him to get in, which most likely, however, the fact that he couldn't speak English and French was a negative. After 9 years of being in Canada, my dad set off back to go to Syria when he had been fluent English speaker by now, and found my mom living in Damascus in 1985. After their marriage in Syria, he brought her to Canada as an immigrant and started to raise a family. In 1986, my brother Mustafa was born. In 1988, my brother Basil was born. And that same year, my mom's brother Loay immigrated to Canada because in Syria, where he was living, their government had been discrimination towards the Sydney people living in Hama, called the 1982 Hama Massacre. My uncle didn't want a part of this because he was Sydney, so he immigrated to Canada to achieve freedom and an opportunity to start fresh. He was a math teacher but couldn't be one in Canada because his English wasn't good. So instead, he looked to my father in learning how to be a radiator mechanic, as he was one himself. He later on became a radiator mechanic and now has his own shop called the Golden Radiator. After finally being able to live in the same country as his sister and having his own shop, where he decided to permanently stay in Canada and raise a family. In 1997, my parents decided to expand the family by having one more child. That's where I was born. The following year, on January 23rd, 1998. My family doesn't play a big role in Canadian immigration, but hopefully this is a step forward for the next generation.